So, welcome to Legal Awareness web series. We have a special guest today, leading lawyer and activist, someone who has been writing on personal laws, divorce, property law, has published number of books from Oxford University Press, and more than just talking of laws, has been working for the women on ground, taking up their causes to the court, because most of us, we appreciate or criticize law, but we never really help women on ground. So we have Flavia Agnes, who has written a number of articles for EPW. Manushi is our leading feminist and someone who really works amongst women, and therefore she is the best person to talk about the recent controversial judgment of single judge of Bombay High Court's Nagpur bench. But before I go to the Nagpur judgment, I have so much to ask Flavia. Let me, to begin with, ask you how you develop your interest in law.
Actually, I had no interest in law. I was just an ordinary housewife. It's because of my own situation, and I had to approach the court for my own release. And then I felt that one can intervene here much better than what's happening today. And somehow a women's perspective is not there, a special women's perspective. I come from I was part of the women's movement, and that's why I decided. We already had a small NGO called Women's Center, and here we could do everything, evolve strategies for battered women. But when it came to the issue of intervention by court, we realized that feminist understanding of law was lacking. There were very few lawyers, some of them practiced in this area, but it was not their exclusive field. So I felt that if I become a lawyer, and having gone through domestic violence myself and experienced the court myself, how difficult it is to approach a court, how long it takes, your perspective is not understood by judges, all these problems. Even your drafting is not exactly what you would want it to be, and very stereotyped petitions are there, etc. So one size fits all kind of theory. So that's how I did my law. So I did with a specific, it's not that I did law for fancy. I did the law for a very specific purpose, that I could help women, not just with the social support, but particularly legal intervention. So I was already part of this NGO. I helped to set it up. And then I completed my law, and
Go ahead.
Oh God, I got a phone call from you. I was part of this NGO, and then I started intervening in the court on behalf of women who were approaching the organization. And that's how I started. It started very organically and in a very focused manner, that I was counseling women, I was helping them, sort of mutual support, etc. And then when the law got added to it, I was able to bring the practical difficulties of women into the realm of law. So all my legal intervention has been from the perspective of women experience law on the ground. So even if you see my book, there is something like a connection between life and law. Law is not in a pure form. Law always gets there's an intervention between life experience and what the law says, and you have to bridge that gap in order for women to get rights.
Correct. So in 1990, Flavia founded Majlis. Very interesting name, means association. But how do you see that it has been almost 3 decades? What Majlis has achieved in 3 decades?
Actually, there were like 3 or 4 of us. Each one had special interest. I had interest in law. My colleagues had interest in culture, and both of us were interested in rights. How do you like? My friend used to say, "Culture is right, and right is culture." That time, that sentence didn't make much sense, but over the period, with your food choices, your clothes, the way you dress, the way you speak, the way you live your life, everything got like questioned. So what she said made a lot of sense to me, that right is culture and culture is right. So otherwise, people used to say how you can have a center which is involved with culture and what is involved with law. But then some of our, if you see films, documentary films dealing with these issues, etc., they bring that sense that how we reach a lot of people, it is through culture. We have to understand the cultural impact of the changes in law. So that's how NGO started, with a very clear understanding of rights. And the rights is much broader than what the statute of law is. So that's how Madhis grew. And we were able to do a lot of intervention for women by practically intervening in court. But then I thought, writing about it, newspaper articles, books on law teaching, etc., you have to intervene there for the law to have wider impact. So that's how I went about, not just giving legal help, but more specifically to make this understanding of law into a cultural form, and that ordinary women can relate to it, ordinary people can relate to it. It doesn't get confined only to law schools or to the courts. It goes in a wider framework, because unless it has a wider framework, the social and cultural ethos will not change. Something like rape, something like domestic violence, violence against women in particular, property rights, women owning property, all these were very like also linked to culture. Triple talaq.
All right. So the ideology of Majlis is that you want to give access to justice for all women. That is what your vision is. So have you reached somewhere in your vision? How do you yourself, as the founder of Majlis, rate success or failures? How are you satisfied with Majlis's work in last 3 decades?
Yes, in some sense, it deals with all issues concerning violence against women, rape, sexual violence, domestic violence, all of these, and also like desertion, matrimonial reliefs. Each of them has a women's angle to it. So most of the lawyers can appear for men and women. Today they are arguing on behalf of the woman. Tomorrow they are arguing against the woman. All this kind of confusion, I found it extremely constrained. This kind of then you're not going deeper into the issue. So my understanding was the violence occurs because of subordination. It is an issue of rights, who has rights and who do not have rights. So I am often asked, even men suffer violence, even men face this, why don't you help them? So the issue here is we are talking about a structural violence. We are talking about a broad framework in which violence is allowed to persist, whether it is a caste issue, whether it is a Hathras case, whether it is sexual violence that's happening everywhere, which goes beyond, it's not just gender-based, but it is more power-based. So we have to look at the power equations between men and women, and that's how our framework, we are able to follow a particular framework and justify the work that we do And that also helps us to evolve newer strategies. That also helps us to get search for positive judgments, where the judges are extremely sensitive to women rather than highlighting the negative judgments where all the judges are against all women. That cannot be the framework. As we get more rights in the statute, written into the statute, unless we are able to execute it, we are able to change the culture of the court, the culture of the judges, we are not able to go any further, even if there is a law. So that's been our Majlis in that way, very experimental, that to see how far we can push the boundaries of law.
Very good. So Majlis's mission is to help women across clans and communities access justice by creating what you call culture of rights. So can you a little bit elaborate on what do you mean by this culture of rights?
Let's talk about, say, matrimonial home. A woman leaves her home and she's made to believe that a husband's home is her home. That's a family law, family property. They both have rights. Children can have rights over there. Belongs to everybody. But if you see the law, there's an ownership issue here, possession and ownership. Now, the husband or his family owns that property, whereas a woman occupies that, but that also has not much legitimacy. That is only through the approval of the husband and his family. And if they don't want her there, then she herself believes that she doesn't have rights. But you have to very firmly believe that this is my house. After marriage, I left my parental home and I've come here where I have a right to be there, to own this property, to occupy this property. Now, after the Domestic Violence Act got enacted in 2005, this right got certain legitimacy and the judges began to accept it. But before that, it was not so. And we had rights such as, we had judgments such as, if she forcibly enters the home of her husband when she's dispossessed, then she is trespassing. She is equal to any stranger trespassing that house, though she was very ceremoniously given this right through the contract of marriage, through the sacramental aspect of marriage. But unless you change the perspective of culture, she's entering this home with full rights. Rights in law, rights in culture, rights in a cultural understanding that this is her house now. No, this is no other house. So that takes long time, even for women themselves to accept it. She always thinks she can only be there at the will of the husband or his family. She doesn't own an independent right. But today, there are a lot of women going to court to enforce this right, that they have a right to reside in the husband's home. You can get an injunction restraining the husband or the in-laws from throwing her out. Now, this right was already there in CPC, for instance. She could get an injunction restraining the husband from throwing her out. But even the judges were not able to understand this. That is why the concept of a woman trespassing into the house. So what is the meaning of that sacrament? What is the meaning of being joined as one person in every religion, every matrimonial contact? This aspect is very deeply ingrained, but it's never there in the culture. It is never there in the family. So how do you make it happen? Because of the campaign, then a law change, and then a statute came, and then these problems were taken to the court. And if many lawyers were not aware of it when it started, 2005. But we had believed in this even before the law came, and we were able to get restraining orders. Once the law came, it became easier for judges to accept it. It is very important that judges understand a new statute. So it is the duty of a lawyer to make the judges understand, either through judicial academies or through actual litigation in a particular case, making a relevant case law, which can be cited by others. These have been our mission, that we want to do this.
Good. So tell me something about this Rahat initiative of Majlis. where you help victims of sexual violence. So what has been, what do you do?
I joined the women's movement around the anti-rape campaign in after the Mathura case, etc., 1980. Wanted a rape law reformed, etc. And we got that reform also. But on the ground, things never changed, and nobody followed what happens in the court, actual court. And the acquittal rate is very high. This is because the manner in which the court is structured, the manner in which criminal law is structured, is more friendly towards the accused person. It is the state versus the accused individual, accused person as an individual. So the balance of power is very screwed up. Here you give all the advantages to the. So we felt that once a reform law is changed, you have to practice it on the ground. But my training is more into civil law, not familiar with criminal law. And you also understand that in criminal law, there are only two parties, the state versus the accused. You are either a public prosecutor or you are a defense lawyer. There's no possibility of a third option. Now, when you see a rape case, for instance, a child is raped, who is about 8 or 10 or 12. A mother or somebody has taken this child to the police. And this much is very widely known that when there is a heinous crime, you always go to the police, whether it's a murder or whether it is rape. This is very common knowledge. You go, you file an FIR. Then what happens? Then there are so many steps, there were 10 or 15 steps after the rape, before the trial. Nobody is engaged with those processes. And then suddenly you get called to court after 2 or 3 years. And Karkun goes to her house and tells her, tomorrow is your date. It is giving a blind exam. For instance, the child who may not have gone to school, is a school dropout. She is asked questions by a very astute criminal lawyer to repeat what she told the police at the stage of FIR. She doesn't know the procedure, she doesn't know the dynamics, she doesn't know who is for her, who's against her, etc. And she's asked to ask questions like, what time did the incident occur? What were you wearing? Where was how did you feel when you were raped? All these kind of irrelevant questions. Nobody has told her how these questions have to be answered. It's like a law student coming and answering exams on a blind state that nobody has told her anything. What is an exam? How it has to be done? So we felt unless that gap is filled, you cannot get a conviction at all. So in the cross-examination, she's strict. A small child is tricked into all this to give it an answer, which is not possible for a judge to convict. So we started this project. We started it in a particular case when a 4-year-old girl was raped by the school watchman. And police were not ready to even take her complaint on record. And when we saw this in the newspaper, we felt that there's no way this woman can win this case against the school authorities. The school trust was fully backing the school watchman. They had a lot of money. They could engage a lawyer like Majid Memon and an astute criminal lawyer. And we felt that what hope this woman has, who's illiterate, who's a migrant from UP or Bihar somewhere. Her child is 4-year-old. They're not English speaking. And how can she ever win this? And it happened to be the school very close to our office. So we approached the mother and we told her that if you need help, we are there for you. Left a visiting card with her, with their family. The mother couldn't understand young women as lawyers. You're so used to having one like middle-aged, bald male person as a lawyer. So they didn't pay any serious attention to us. But after a few days, they approached us because the police was not responding to them. So we told them, if you need, we will help you. We will be their support person for you. And you won't believe this, the judge there who conducted the case very sensitively was Judge Ganediwala. And that was our first interaction with her. Our second case also was decided by her, where it was a Muslim family. When the mother went for the delivery, the father had raped the eldest daughter. Again, for about 18 months, she had tried to file a case, but the police were not ready to take her case. Finally, with some social worker intervention, they filed the case. You won't believe how sensitive the judgment is. 18 months delay. And the judge said, what can the victim, a illiterate woman and her child do? She has about 4 or 5 children. Husband is staying there. Even though the community believes nobody is helping her, she went to 3-4 times to the police station. And in the judgment, judge wrote that if the delay is caused by the non-cooperation of the police, how can we blame the mother for filing the case late? I mean, she is not to be blamed at all. She had every intention of filing the case. And we got conviction in that case also. So we have seen this judge.
From the same judge?
From the same judge, in the same courtroom, yeah. 2 different people from our organization were following up this, two different cases. And one of the lawyers had just passed out. She used to go as a support person along with the victim when she was deposing, etc. And we did sort of a mock trial for her, like what kind of questions can be asked and how they should reply, what's the manner in which we reply. Now, at that time, POCSO had not come in. It was prior to POCSO. And the judge was so sensitive that the victim should not face the accused person during the trial. So she arranged the cupboard in her courtroom in a way that accused cannot see directly the victim, who both are in the court. Now, these are some of the measures, and we said even before the act, a judge who is sensitive can do all this and provide a level playing ground to the victim. Another thing she used to do is when the child comes to depose, usually the accused person and the child sit in the same place. She used to ensure that the child waits in her chamber, comes to a different entrance and waits in the chamber till the matter is called out, so that the accused cannot intimidate her or his relatives cannot intimidate her before she gives evidence in court. So she's not ruffled at all. So these are some of the measures we thought only a very sensitive judge can do, rather than any judge or a human judge.
Yeah, someone who was that sensitive when even POCSO law was not there. So why suddenly not one but 2 orders, both of them absolutely atrocious? So much so that now even Supreme Court Collegium had withdrawn the recommendation of making her a permanent. So since your organization has appeared before her when she was a trial judge, can you throw some light why? Because this whole interpretation of Section 7 and Section 8 are absolutely wrong. Word direct is not there. Expression skin to skin is not there. So why suddenly this good judge has turned so bad?
That is what I fail to understand, and that is why what drove me to write that article, because I have seen this judge performing in a court myself, an entire team. We have seen her over a period of 2 or 3 years in the City Civil Court in Mumbai, where she was very much part of the Rahat scheme of things. And we evolved many things with her help, with her understanding. So that is why I just failed to understand what makes a judge, high court judge, adopt a certain approach, pro-accused approach, when as a trial judge he had an approach which is totally victim friendly. So that is why, I mean, what happens to the judges and what are supposed to be more sensitive, they're supposed to go to various trainings before they are elevated, etc. And this judge was deputy director of the Maharashtra Judicial Academy. She was the one who was structuring the trainees, and that is why Justice Madan Lokur's recent article, she says that if this judge was in charge of judicial academy, what kind of training to the junior judges she would have imparted. And that's what shocks me. What shocks Justice Madan Lokur is something also which shocks me personally. And not only just shocks, it is very painful. It is very painful because the judges, in a way, make the law. It's not the statute. It is its interpretation in the court that gives actually flesh and blood to the statute, provisions of the statute. And if this happens in Maharashtra to a judge like this, I mean, what hope we have in the judiciary in future? It's not this judge or that judge. This judge gave this judgment, that he gave two judgments. We have not studied other POCSO judgments. What are the other judges thinking about? What are the other judges following? Because they have been trained by her. So how do we look at these things? This is the most difficult part of this entire thing. And that's what drove me to write this. I really want to share my anguish more than anything else. Because I cannot believe. I just cannot believe this.
Correct. So, Flavia, as one of our celebrated feminist activists, someone who has dedicated entire life to the cause of women, how come you are against Uniform Civil Code when it is presented to us as if it is a solution of all problems of our women?
I think before we go to the Uniform Civil Code demand, I think more importantly, it is to understand the rights given in various personal laws. What is it a community of women do not have extra, which the Uniform Civil Code will give us? That is a core question. Now, here what is happening, I feel, much more than the actual law, what is happening is certain myths, certain propaganda that per se Muslims are backward and Muslim law has no rights. Now, when I was researching for my book, Family Law, what one understood very clearly is many of the matrimonial law concepts of today have come to us from Muslim law. They have not come from the Christian law, they have not come from the Hindu law, they have come from the Muslim law from its beginning. For instance, to give you examples, marriage is a contract. This is a very modern concept. Whereas under Hindu law, marriage is a sacrament. Under Christian law, it's become a contract. But if you look at one law, this is a civil right. This is a contract between a husband and wife. And that contract has to have a certain equity. Not necessarily equality, but a notion of equity has to be written into it. Next is consent. Special Marriage Act has consent, which is taken from the Christian personal law. Now, Christian personal law has consent because in 1800, the Napoleon's code, in fact, said that marriage is a contract. And consent is essential. Now, in Hindu law, even today, consent is implied. But what is essential is going around the fire, what we call homa, vivaho. Now, a lot of communities don't have this. And there is inequality into the entire ritual of marriage itself, where you give away your daughter, Sridan, not Sridan, Kanyadan. You give away, where you give your daughter away as if she's a property which belongs to you, and now you give it away, and now she is no longer belonging here. Now, such a concept cannot be in a contract at all. So, what we have in Hindu law is a mixture. Conceptually, there is conceptually there is a consent, but in actuality, there is no consent when you give away your daughter. Now, these are some many things that are there. So it is very confusing. Now, in Christian law, for instance, maintenance amounts were so low, very low, because it is only sufficient for her to keep her body and mind together and not beyond that. Whereas in Muslim law, first only at the time of marriage, it is envisaged that there may be problem in this marriage later. So she needs a safeguard. She needs an amount of meher, part of property, or a certain amount, or jewelry, etc., which the husband has to give her if he wants to marry her. It is out of respect for her, but it's also because she needs to be safeguarded. Nobody thought of marriage that the girl needs a safeguard. Now I can mention many things why Muslim law of marriage is where women have much better rights than Hindu law. Hindu law had to be reformed time and again. European Christian law also, upon marriage, a woman had no right to own property. So now here, when you see all these actually in law, I'm not saying they are in practice, but they are in law. What you want to bring in is the same concept. You don't want to bring in anything different than this. So I find it extremely difficult why this knowledge is not spread among the journalists, among the people, among women, among the Islamic scholars. I find it is totally lacking here. And it's some illusion, some myth that we are holding on to. And everybody believes it. But when we have taken up cases of Hindu women and Muslim women, in fact, a Hindu woman in a polygamous marriage and a Muslim woman in a polygamous marriage, we find that the Muslim woman is better protected, whereas the Hindu woman has no rights at all. She can be termed as a concubine. This is what monogamy did when it was introduced in the Hindu law. Culturally, it was not accepted, but legally, the woman had no rights. So when you see many of these things, you feel like, who has made this law? Why these laws were made? Did the people not have an understanding how women will be treated once these laws come? And particularly when women come, whenever divorce was introduced, alongside divorce, property right was not introduced at all. So now you say irretrievable breakdown of marriage, a new modern concept, or mutual consent divorce, a modern concept. Muslim law had all of this in the 7th century. And hence, meher has to be there, 3 months maintenance has to be there, then she needs a fair and reasonable protections for life. All these are there, inherent. But I feel the patriarchy is so strong in our culture, in our society, that whatever is positive there for women gets very easily erased. And whatever is against women gets very easily accepted. For instance, dowry. But instead of meher, we today have dowry among all communities. Dowry, again, in fact, is not a Hindu concept. What was there among the Hindus was a Varadakshina and a Sridhan. Now, that Sridhan has no validity. It's not there in the Muslim law, Hindu law at all. So, what we extrapolate is Section 27 has ingrained contractual understanding that a woman can claim her property under Section 27. But Section 27 refers to property jointly brought by the husband and wife after their marriage. Only that right is there. There is no right to get your Sridhan back. There is no right for anything else. Whereas the Muslim law very clearly says
that the British judges are also responsible for not understanding the concept of Istri Dhan, because under English law, women were not entitled to be the owners of the property.
Absolutely, absolutely. According to me, the modern Hindu law is an amalgamation, is a mixture of patriarchy under the Brahminical culture and patriarchy under the English law.
Correct.
It is both coming together and make marriage rights of women even worse than what Hindu law per se had or what Muslim law per se had. The statutory law is a total mixture of patriarchy where women are deprived all rights. The Steaton right, if you can see in my book, I mean, for about 100 years, they extinguished the Steaton right altogether. And they said women cannot own property because English law doesn't have a right to property. How can Hindu law have?
Even the Manusmriti itself talks of women can own number of kinds of properties. Even
I didn't get you.
That
Even
women can be the owners of the property.
Correct. And now here you see judgments, another kind of judgments where Muslim women's right is protected by the English courts. And that's very strange. And there they say that Muslim law is far superior than Hindu law or the English law. We have judgments like this. And I've put it in my book on Muslim law, all this in detail, that a Muslim woman doesn't lose her rights in marriage. She can own a separate property. If the husband uses her money, her resources, he has to return that if he wants to divorce her. All these are there, which are not there in any other law. So I feel that what can uniform civil code give beyond what is there in Muslim law?
Thank you.
And the father thinks he was right.
Yeah.
Over his daughter.
Yeah, for having a wonderful conversation. I think I need to bother you again when you can talk in Hindustani, so that my audience and viewers can really benefit. Thank you so much. We wish you all the luck.
We really admire you for your capacity to talk in Hindustani, in English, quoting law books and English judgments. I really enjoy your presentation, which reaches everybody. So we many times in our office meetings, we play that to understand triple talaq issue, to understand other issues, that how well you can explain complicated legal concepts in simple Hindustani or Hindi and
that
also
is
English.
the legal awareness web series that we now try to educate non-law students. I have spent years in teaching law students. The whole idea of legal awareness web series is to take law to the ordinary people. So thank you so much. We are going to bother you again. Good luck.
My pleasure, sir. I would love to speak.
Soon. Thank you so much. So,
okay, thank you.
Agnes, our feminist activist, lawyer, who has spent a lifetime in taking up causes of women. I would request you to kindly subscribe to Legal Awareness web series, share this video widely, and I am sure that Flavia will be again with us sooner than later. Thank you so much.